Welcome to the Global Tech Leaders Podcast, where we help business leaders and individual contributors with actionable insights to hit their number and figure out the nuances of truly operating a business globally today, squeezing the essence of the lessons learned from the planet's top tech leaders. This is your guide to joining the fast track to global market scaling.
Welcome, I'm Ross Lauder, your host from Single Focus Talent, and I'm joined by our non-exec director, John Quigley, today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Today we're joined by Louise Walsh. Louise Walsh has had a long career in tech on the recruitment side. And the reason I wanted to bring Louise on today's podcast was to walk through some of the challenges you're going to have as a well-funded pre-IPO startup in that hyperscale mode. So Louise has spent time at Google and also in HubSpot, which I feel has the guts of her most relevant, applicable experience for our listeners today. So she can walk us through what it's like to be involved in a pre-IPO startup that's at that $100 million level. They've just landed in EMEA. They've got a Dublin office, and it's pressing the go button to ramp up, which brings with it massive levels of craziness, I suppose, is the easiest way to put it. So welcome to today's call, Louise.
Thank you very much, Ross.
So look, just start off with where you started your career, what brought you to where you are, why you're passionate about tech, and also, share some of those anecdotes along the way. So maybe just walk us through your career thus far, if you would.
Yeah, certainly. So nobody starts out thinking, I want to be a recruiter. Everybody always says they fall into it by chance. But for me, that wasn't the case. I very purposely got my first recruiting job by design. And the reason why is I had studied law and I was really interested in people, but the law was a bit too dry. So I thought I love talking to people and I love hearing people's stories and talking about their careers. Boom, I'll go and be a recruiter. Now, obviously it wasn't as simple in real life, Ross, but nonetheless, here I am a decade later. So I started off, I went to an agency for a short couple of months. And then by what I can only describe as, maybe divine intervention, I got an email one day from the team at Google saying, okay, we're launching this new sourcing team. We're looking for contractors. Will you come along? So I was like, yep, definitely not going to look the gift horse in the mouth there. So I didn't think I was going to get it, but I said I'll go along for the interview anyway, get the experience, see what Google is like. So by some absolute wave of chance, I did get it. So I got an 11-month contract there, and that was really my first, step into the big tech world. So then I was there for my 11 months for my contract, and afterwards I was kind of floating around a bit. I was going to go traveling. I was like, working in an agency, and was kind of waiting for the next big thing, and boom, along came HubSpot. It was literally like an orange rock had fallen out of the sky. And I think you probably felt the same, Ross, when you saw the brand for the first time, did you?
Very much so. It was one that I hadn't heard of, and I actually pursued them. I was in a sales leadership role at the time, and I took a step back to an individual contributor role in the enterprise space, simply because once you do your homework on them, it's fairly mind-blowing what they've been able to achieve. They were at that Series D stage. They had $100 million in funding, and they'd really tried to run the EMEA piece remotely from Boston, which can only go so far, right, until you get that local presence. So that was my kind of introduction. So yeah, please continue, share more.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I was kind of looking around and I wanted to go somewhere. Obviously, I didn't want to go back to the same scale as Google, where you kind of have a smaller role because the machine is so big. So this was ideal for me. And same thing, I applied for it, and it was an initial 6-month contract. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to just take a chance. Obviously, at the time, I was like 24, so I didn't have many commitments. And I thought, I'll take the chance, I'll take the contract, I'll go in there, I'll work my socks off, and they won't be able to do without me in 6 months. And thankfully, my plan worked. So we went into HubSpot. I was about employee 50, I think. Maybe I was 2 or 3 months after you.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think I was in that first 15 wave. It was 2 times.
Yeah. So I came in, there was about 50 people there. And it's just so funny thinking back now to our experience compared to the scale. that it's grown to. But I guess, that's a joy of a startup or a scale up.
And when you first sat down at your desk, I suppose on the Monday morning, like what was your remit from day one, and then how did that shift as each quarter rolled by?
That's a great question. So I always looked after the sales business, and like by the time I left, I think there was something like, there was only like 8 or 9 salespeople whom I hadn't hired out of an org of about 140. So so I was there for 2.5 years, but it was immensely gratifying seeing the sales org. And yourself, we worked with some amazing people, and seeing every month new waves of talent coming in. So yeah, it was tough, but it was also very much worth it.
And in terms of recruiting, what was the split with BDRs, with account executives, senior account executives? And I'm kind of keen to dive into the languages as well.
Mm-hmm.
So my own experience when I was running a sales team, DAC was 40% of my number. The UKI
Mm-hmm.
and Benelux was kind of about that 40% level as well. And then I had another 20%, which was kind of everything else beyond that in emerging, etc. What did that breakdown look like from HubSpot's perspective?
It was similar. I think every SaaS business, when they're in the land and expand mode in EMEA, have a similar path. It's well beaten. And in terms of hiring, we started off and we were just basically hiring like a landing team. But the people that we hired, especially in that first 100, every single hire we made was so important, because like those people that we hired in that first 100 are now the directors and the sales leads and the people that are in really, really like high positions where they've made massive contributions to HubSpot. So to go back to when we first started, my first quarter, my remit was hire salespeople, hire account executives, hire channel account executive, CAMs, and it was just keeping that bar, keeping that standard really, really, really high.
And in terms of how you got this talent, I know from myself running my own recruitment agency, I learned a lot of my craft by way of marketing at HubSpot, where I feel that outreach is very value centric, meaning that it's straight to the point. And I think I found that that's led to greater levels of engagement and success. And I'm keen to understand your take on that. And then also, like, how are you selling the role when you get them on the phone? And I think for me, the big mistake people make is they're trying to close a deal there and then. And as HubSpot used to say, it's like going on a first date and asking that date how many children.
Yeah, asking the person to marry on the first date.
Absolutely. Or the more extreme is how many kids do you want. And I think that's not the objective, right? The objective.
Absolutely. And the other one I think we used to say a lot back at HubSpot was, buying the software is like joining the gym. Just because you pay for the gym membership does not mean that you're going to get fit. And it was very much the same for us. So if I use that analogy, it's like putting up ads and like spreading the word on social media and referrals and all that kind of stuff. That's lovely. But we can't rely on that because it's going to be hard to measure and hard to predict over time. Sure. So our my manager at the time used to call it the Holy Trinity, and we had like a three-pronged approach basically, which was headhunting, agencies, and then everything else. So everything else would be referrals, events that we ran, different nights that we hosted, networking, etc. And altogether that would make up about 20%. So yeah, the vast majority was headhunting, and then there was some agencies here and there as well.
And in terms of agencies, I know from my own experience, we get hired to find those unicorns, right? Those hard to find people. And as much as I'd love to get the English speakers covering the English speaking parts of Europe, they're quite plentiful. Sure, I know who the good ones are, that's for certain, but can you tell me maybe where agencies were able to add value in that scaling process?
Yes, and that's a great question, because when you think of leading the recruitment campaigns internally and then agencies, you want an agency who can complement you, and that was very much our strategy at HubSpot. Like, I would have loved to outsource my job to an agency, but I don't think the leadership team would have been too happy. So where we got value from agencies at different times was in their own networks. So if you the agency, stick up an ad, that's not going to do anything different to my ad. but it's the agencies who have these like ongoing relationships with candidates in our target market. Like you might know somebody from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and they might not be moving. And hearing from you, you know, their agency confidant who they've worked with before is probably going to be more effective than me, a stranger, reaching out. So I think that's the crucial gap where agencies added value for us.
So just for clarification, Louise, HubSpot land in Ireland, they're very much along this hyper growth curve, as we call it, right? They're on a very much an upward trajectory. And just for the listeners, hyper growth mode is any organization that is kind of doing 40% plus compound annual growth in revenue. Now HubSpot are renowned for, you could probably add another 0 on the end of that 40, right? They were doing hundreds of percentiles. They were doubling, tripling revenue.
Look at with Ross and his, with people like Ross on the sales team, I thought we were going to run out of software jobs. I thought they were going to say we have no more licenses left.
Yeah. So when organizations tend to scale into Europe, they're kind of in the second stage. There's probably about 3 stages of that hyper growth curve, right? The first stage is what we call the Edison stage, right? It's really that kind of light bulb moment where, you know, is this working? Does it, you know, is there value in the market? Yes.
Is there a market here? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we found kind of we found product market or market product fit. The second stage, it sounds like they were on the second stage when they hit Ireland, which is what we call the Model T stage. It's really about that cookie cutter, or, you know, Henry Ford, you can have any color as long as it's black. And there was that real kind of engineered, systematic approach to pretty much everything that was done. So my question is, when you're going about the recruitment endeavors, and, you know, a daunting task by the sounds of things for you, when you look at, you know, we got to get, you know, in line with these public announcements that have been made of, you know, 200, 300 employees.
I know,
that's a lot of bodies, right?
Sorry, I was just going to say, whenever I saw the Irish Times announcing, you know, 250 new jobs, my friends would take pictures of it and text me and be like, I presume you won't be out on Friday night?
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah.
How clear, this is my question, right? How clear were you about the profile of people that you needed? And did that change over time? So there's a hypothesis all the time from American organizations coming into Europe that this is the kind of profile and attributes of the people that we need, because, you know, they seem to be working well in the US. But, you know, is that a little bit different? Like, how clear were you about the profile of people? So your 3-pronged strategy, when you're going out there and you're executing on that, how clear were you about the profile of people you needed? And did that change over time?
That's a great question, and an interesting one, because it didn't change that much, to be honest. It was like, it definitely wasn't a cookie cutter approach where we'll hire clones of each other, but I guess the intrinsic qualities and the drivers in the heart of everybody that we hired were similar. So we had great diversity in terms of, you know, the usual categories like gender, race, age, that kind of stuff. But when all of the normal stuff was peeled back, and that kind of hunger and intelligence and ability to learn something and to keep going even when it's hard, that was the main thing that we hired for, regardless of the language or the level. So to your original question, I don't think that did change. No, like, yes, we became more open to, for example, people who mightn't have finished university. That's something that we looked at less over time, but we always looked at the heart, I suppose.
That's really interesting when you say the kind of balance around gender, race and age and stuff like that. Was that a purposeful strategy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And how do you pull that off, right? Because a lot of organizations would say that, well, you know, you get what you get, and, you know, we're not in control per se of the people that are looking to get these roles. We just want to get the best people.
So bring me back on to another episode, please, and we can spend the whole thing talking about diversity hiring, because I could literally wax lyrical about this for the night, but I won't get off of my soapbox. So in terms of diversity hiring, yes, absolutely, it was an effort. It was always an effort. It's always a consistent effort. But what a lot of talent people think diversity hiring is going to LinkedIn and searching for the top 100 female names. That's not what I'm referring to at all. Anybody can do that. What I'm referring to is making the culture and the company and the office appropriate and inviting for the types of people that you want to hire.
Okay.
I love that. That's very well put, Louise. I love that.
But it's very true, you know, like for example, and I've always done this throughout my entire career. If I'm speaking to you on a first round interview, I'll try to get a little handle of, you know, who you are as a person. But then we need to be, or well, anybody who's hoping to hire needs to be tying that back in at every stage, you know. So for example, I know that Ross is a family man. I know that his family is a massive priority to him. So if I was selling Ross a role, I would talk a lot about working from home, about flexibility. You know, if you ever need to pick up the kids early, you could just leave the office, Ross. But what I would sell to you, John, for example, could be different depending on what I know your motivators are.
Hopefully the way to get me is talk to me about not working from home. I'm in.
Have you had enough of being at home, John? Week 9. I think I'm actually just getting used to it. I don't remember what life was like before.
Yeah, it's a funny kind of setup at the moment. In fact, I was reading an article only today that LinkedIn did a piece of research that suggests that on average, people working from home are putting in an extra 38 hours a month, which is quite substantial.
Wow.
Yeah, and when you really think about it, it comes down to the meetings you have, the wasted time around that, people coming up to your desk asking you questions, which is a great way to kind of get somebody's attention in a work environment. But I think actually from a productivity standpoint, it's leading to greater hours that are kind of more focused. Now, obviously kids plays into all of that stuff as well, but just an interesting statistic. In any case, shifting gears a small bit here, I suppose I'd like to hear some of those anecdotes, Louise, around the sort of needs to hire around languages. And I know German is the one that we kind of specialize in. Would you share with us a couple of your stories around where you went the extra mile to get some of that class talent on board?
Absolutely. And this is a very interesting point. I'm glad you raised it. And it ties neatly into what I was saying about customizing your offering to the person. And more so than ever with an international hire. Like if you, and I'm sure you guys could speak to this as well, but if you're reaching out to somebody and you're a complete stranger, they don't know you, and you're asking them to leave their home country to move to a different country to work for you, that's a big deal. So some of the things that came up over the years were funny. Like I always regale friends at parties with stories of my recruiting over the years. Like for example, we had, and I'm sure you'll remember him as well, a really nice young guy who was like maybe 2 years out of college. And I just, back to the heart thing, I just from speaking to him, I knew he was the right person for sales at HubSpot. I just was like, okay, you have that kind of fire, you're the guy for us. So he's in Cologne, has really never heard much about Dublin. So anyway, we worked through a process. He accepts our offer. We're very, very excited to get him on board. And he calls me about 6 weeks before, no, sorry, he was due to come. He said, like, I'll come in 2 weeks. I said to him, why don't you take a little bit longer, you know, get your affairs in order in Germany, find somewhere to live in Dublin, emphasis on find somewhere to live in Dublin. So I was kind of trying to prep him, you know, that the rental market in Dublin is really, really, really tight. Like, get prepared early. So over came our German colleague, and about 2 weeks out, he rang me and was like, I don't think I can come. So you know yourself, when you've worked really hard on bringing somebody into the team for weeks and weeks and weeks, your heart kind of sinks when they go, yeah, I don't think I can come. I was going, oh no, what's the problem? And he said, I just can't find accommodation, you know. And I said, okay, we'll do this. Book a hotel for the first 3 nights and you can expense it back. We'll deal with the approvals later. Just book a hotel for the first 3 nights. You have to still come.
Nice.
And then I gave really, really serious thought to putting him up for a month in my own apartment. Wow. So I had worked so hard on getting this guy to sign the contract that I was like, could I? So I called my flatmate at the time, very patient lady, but no. She was like, can a German man I've never met sleep on our couch for a month? No.
That is cool, albeit not scalable, right? So in terms of, and I love it. I love the initiative in terms of the, and it sounds like you were really bought into what you were doing, right? To get the result and the outcome, which is amazing as well. But in terms of kind of scalability, this whole concept of ghosting, right, is pretty big, and it's growing. Seems to be growing very much. I'm not going to jump in and generalize and say, that all millennials are kind of, guilty of this type of thing. I'm sure it happens across all age cohorts. But do you have for our listeners, would you have any kind of strategies or hacks or ways that to help them to avoid getting ghosted by candidates who don't show up, pretty much, right? You give them the job, they go through a process, and then they just go missing. Have you found any ways or any things that work well to I'm not saying eliminate it, but certainly to reduce the possibility of getting ghosted?
Absolutely. So thankfully, I'm trying to really rack my brains. I don't think that specific thing, like somebody not turning up on day one, has ever happened to me, thankfully. But I have had people who are like, let me give you an example from my experience in Atlassian here in Australia. I had this candidate, he was hired for a software engineer role. We had got like a visa for his family in place, like got the ball rolling there, very, very far along, a difficult process. And he called me one day and was like, I'm really sorry that, but I won't be able to come to Australia. I was like, oh dear, what seems to be the problem? And he's like, I just discussed it with my wife and she said she doesn't want to move to Australia. And I was like, hang on a second, reverse here. This guy had been through like 5-6 rounds of interviews, and he didn't think it was pertinent before that point to discuss it with his wife.
Wow. He was in stealth mode.
Oh God, I wasn't pleased. I was like, really? When she said, how was your day? You couldn't have said, oh, I got offered a job in Australia. But anyway, so to answer your question, how you avoid that kind of shenanigans, I think is just cut it off, call it out really early in the process. So Ross will tell you this, I'm a pretty straight shooter. But also I don't think anybody should be going along with it for the sake of politeness. So for example, if I'm speaking to somebody now, ever since I was burned the last time, like for example, if I was speaking to Ross about a role in Sydney, I would ask him on every single call, what is your wife thinking about moving to Sydney? Where will your kids go to school in Sydney? And if I think that he's not actively doing those things in the background, it may come to a point where I say to him, listen, are you really serious about this? Let's put it on hold for 6 months. It's not now or never. We can always stay in touch. But if now isn't the right time for you to relocate, that's totally fine. Yeah. And I think it's having those open conversations and just calling it out. And, if somebody is ignoring your calls all the time, a bit of common sense, it's probably not a good sign. So I would just send them an email and be like, listen, it feels like you're dodging my calls. Please give me a call back before close of business today. And if they don't, well, you kind of know where you stand then, don't you?
I couldn't agree more. It's a very, very pertinent point. I moved to Cork from Dublin, and some would argue that's a culturally huge step within the same country. Moving from Dublin to Cork was a big thing, and obviously we had a house that we had bought. I had to have that conversation with my wife, and I ended up commuting for 6 months, and I ended up fishing out a job for her in the same company down there as well, and we had a great time. But I suppose one of the things that was extremely memorable for me was the recruiter did the exact same as that on every call. It was like, what about Cork? What about Cork? And she sold it to me very well. And it's very much that Sandler sales methodology, which is at the end of a call or a process where you're like, it sounds like this opportunity is no longer a priority in your business. Why and that's it. Having this discussion, and I think if you can do that, John has a fantastic one that I love, and I'm going to jump in here. John, do you think we're here sat around the table thinking up ways to rip you off? And obviously the answer is no. Or fool you or dupe you into a job that you're going to hate. And obviously their answer is no, but I think getting to that no is crucial. or getting to that yes?
Absolutely. And it doesn't need to be awkward at all. Like, I just say to people, listen, like, you know, obviously now it's moving to Australia. Before it was moving to Dublin. It doesn't matter where it's moving to. You could be moving to, you know, Timbuktu. But I would say to them, on the first call, what does this move look like for you? So if somebody tells me I have 6 children, they're all in school, and my wife has never left our home village in Sweden, that's obviously going to be a very different process than a journey you're going to go on with a single person, for example. So I think it's just all about, as you said yourself, having that transparency right from the get-go, and setting your expectations.
Well, their answer is going to tell you if they've given it some thought as well, right? So
Absolutely.
you ask that question, and their answer might give you a few hints that they've put in a bit of research already, that they've had multiple discussions. The answer might be, well, you know, my kids are at an age where school isn't really a consideration. So, you know, I feel we'd have plenty of time to look at that.
People can always comment to that. Like, and even, obviously, you know, I never want to overstep the boundary and ask somebody their personal business, but a question like, have you looked at neighborhoods in Sydney where your family might like to live? If somebody's at offer stage or final interview stage and they're not there, you need to be asking them what's going on. And thankfully, because I have that approach, I've very rarely been ghosted, but I have many times been like, hey, listen, it sounds like this isn't going to work right now. We'll part ways as friends. We'll stay in touch for the future. I have hired people, you know, a year later.
Yeah, I think that's a great style. John, did you ever take a job without asking your wife?
Well, I did something even worse than that, actually. I set up a company and, you know, put all of our futures into an, you know, fairly unsecure.
Oh, wow.
I mean, and it was kind of halfway through the journey that you know, we were having a conversation, and I was saying, "Oh, I forgot to tell you this was the journey that we were on." You know, it was just kind of taken for granted. You know, so I'm not the best guy to ask in relation to that, and we have moved once or twice to different. I just moved back to Dublin actually this year. I was in the west of Ireland for quite some time. And we had moved for certain opportunities. Now those were discussed, but I did set up a company that I ran and scaled and successfully exited it. So I think the end justified the means there. But I didn't do a great job. I didn't do a great job. Yeah.
Yeah, you're the wrong person to ask. I'm almost certain that
the worst person to
if
ask.
Ross was to accept a full-time permanent role in Berlin, he would definitely let Rebecca know beforehand.
Yeah, I would. My lovely wife would want to know these sorts of things, and I've had a similar experience to John, where I tried the let's try and dupe you first approach, and my wife is far too intelligent for the likes of those shenanigans. I actually helped her. I set up I pitched to her as a conversation with a role. So I wanted her to move to Cork with me. And she spent a lot of her childhood there. She was very familiar with it, etc., but never saw it as somewhere to live. Kind of, it was holiday land for her. And I positioned a phone call with the marketing manager at the time in light of just having a friendly chat to see what was out. And I knew in my heart of hearts that was an interview. But I didn't tell her that. Now, having said that, she ended up, she came off the call. Ross, you told me this was a chat, and it was clearly an interview based on situational examples. And I said, oh really? Was it? Strange that. And then I happened to be going to a meeting with the marketing manager in Cork in a hotel, and we were staying there locally anyway. And I had been hired at this point, and they're like, "Oh, I want to offer the job. I'm fine with it. I just need you to talk to the VP." And she did, and that was kind of history. But that's never happened again. She's well too onto my my tactics at this point in time. So I suppose I'm keen to hear from you, Louise. I know that there's been examples where you've got a candidate who you know would be a rock star, but they're kind of playing that hard to get game where they're like, I'm talking to someone else and I think that. I never ever go with a negative on the other organization. I will tell them honestly.
No, absolutely not.
yeah, it's bad, it's poor, and it's not ethical, quite frankly, and it doesn't work. Moreover, I think I can share a lot of experience because I have 18,464 connections in the market on LinkedIn, and I know a lot.
Wow, you're tracking them carefully.
I'm doing, yeah, no, but it's my kind of bread and butter, as it were. But it's a matter of, I know people in other organizations, and I can tell honestly and ethically firsthand what I know of those companies. I'm very lucky. I've spent 15 years plus in tech, and a lot of my clients are actually my friends. So when I put candidates into organizations, I can say that. But I suppose I'm interested to hear from you, Louise, specifically about a candidate who might have been talking to another organization. You're like, if he can just come in and see us, and we can kind of preempt this and get in his calendar earlier than somebody else, you know, I know we can close this. Maybe tell me a few kind of your anecdotes around that experience, if you would.
Yes. So back to my earlier point about tailoring the offering to your candidate. And, you know, it doesn't need to be complicated at all. I think it's just a bit of extra listening to the candidate at the start. So over my time at HubSpot, we just dealt with different types of situations. Like, obviously everybody has a personal life and a family life. So sometimes people would say, you know, I can't change jobs because I'm hoping to start a family this year. And in that case, I'd be saying, okay, well, if you can hold tight for another 4 or 5 months, then you will be eligible for our great maternity pay package when the time does come, for example. So specifically, I remember a good one around one person was just very, very, very attached to their dog. And every call I had with them, I could hear the dog barking. I just knew they were like a massive dog person. And when I brought them in for the interview, I was like, as you can see, your dog would be welcome. And I could see this guy's eyes just lighting up. He was like, oh my God, I could bring, you know, Rex or whatever to work with me every day. And in cases like that, like, everybody has a trigger. Everybody has something that they like. It could be, you know, a gym in the office, but it could also be something as simple as, you know, you really like your manager. So yeah, again, I think it's just about tailoring, getting to know your candidate, and then personalizing the offering so that it tugs on their heartstrings, if not necessarily their wallet.
Okay, no, that makes sense. In terms of culture, I'm really keen to drill in on that. I often find that there's two types of candidates. There's the guys who like to have their more established organizations, which kind of sell themselves, they're well known. And then there's the guys who are maybe from that ilk, but want to do the startup piece. And choosing that startup is really, really important. And God knows I've made plenty of mistakes in my career. I've been fired, things haven't worked out for me. And I'm very, very transparent about that. But I've learned a lot along the way. How do you sell?
And that's what's important.
No, absolutely. And I would never say otherwise, because it's not the truth. And I've maintained solid relationships with all the people. I've had to fire people myself. It's not pleasant, etc. But it's just part of life. And, you know, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. But how do you really sell a startup? Because it's risky, right? I mean, I suppose being well funded is a bit of a safety net in some regards, that, you know, I can trust these guys. How do you sell a candidate who's maybe in a big iron company, you know, a big established company that might have several thousand employees here in Ireland? How do you sell them on joining that kind of hyperscale startup? And I'm keen to particularly drill in on culture. Like, if you're in a small organization, how do you sell the culture to a candidate?
Yes, so that's a great question. And it reminds me of my experience at Reich. So as you know, I loved HubSpot, and I always said I'd never leave until the stars aligned and I was offered this just really, really interesting opportunity to be the very first employee on the ground in EMEA for Reich. And I was like, wow, you know, the opportunity to grow the office literally from the ground up. Like, the first 8 weeks that Reich were, quote unquote, doing business in Ireland, the office was my living room because it was only me. So in that case, like, we hired people from LinkedIn, we hired people from Salesforce, we hired people, sorry, I probably shouldn't name names, but we hired people from some of those really big brands. And how we did that was just the setting of the opportunity. Like, some people are going to be more risk adverse than others naturally. And some people will be at different stages in their life where they need different types of security. But sometimes you'll find somebody who's up for an adventure, and that's the exact type of person that you need to make your startup successful. So I find it's kind of like, when it works really well, because your expectations are aligned. So I remember telling people coming in to write, they were like, oh, how are things going? And I was like, yeah, I had to walk down to the local shop today to buy a notebook and a pen, because we don't have stationery, like it's just me in the office. And I'm being very transparent about, this is what it is, and is this what you want? And people that do, great. People that want the security of a bigger brand, absolutely best of luck as well. I think it comes down to personal preference for the candidate.
And I suppose, how do you talk to them about like how people interact and what it is they believe in? And I remember in HubSpot, the phrase was use good judgment. So we don't have a HR department, and the tech guys, talked about critical, crit sits, as in the system could potentially fall down. We might have customer latency issues, etc. And there were certain kind of situations where we'd be like, this is a HR crit sit. We have a rogue.
I remember that every day.
And I'd be keen to kind of understand, how did you communicate that to a candidate around the culture? Because the bigger organizations have that kind of well buttoned down, and they have the, high paid consultants in.
Who we are as a business, yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. How did you sell that?
Honesty. Again, obviously everybody would say that, but it's so crucial at that early stage. Like when myself and the brilliant Patricia Duchesne, who came over to be this sales director, I think was her job title when she started, but she went on to be a VP with Reich. And I remember myself and Patricia were sitting in a room together, and we were like, okay, we need to select these people extremely carefully, because whoever comes in the door next is going to be 1/4 of our entire culture. So you want to keep that diversity going, but you also want to be mindful when you're selling to the candidate. It's not so much, I didn't have anything to sell them because it was still evolving. So what I was selling them was, I don't mean to sound cheesy or cliched, but what I was selling them was the opportunity to shape the culture.
Okay.
I think what's more important than that, what I found anyway in organizations, is that, I've been in some organizations where the culture is toxic. I've been in some organizations where it's absolutely wonderful. And the two things that stick out to me is, number one is you have to be really deliberate about your culture, right? Because some people say, well, a culture is naturally what happens, with everybody in the organization and what you stand for and what you do. But I think up front, you have to be very deliberate about that culture. And here's the thing, not everybody buys into a company's culture. And that is absolutely fair enough in my book. The most important thing I feel is that you have to be authentic about your culture. What do you think about that? Authenticity for me is the big thing. That, you have a culture and it's great. You should have a culture, but you should be authentic about that culture.
Yeah, and this is actually, I actually wrote about this for my master's thesis. So good question, great topic. The culture, you do absolutely need to be deliberate. And how you do that, in my opinion, is not by putting up posters on the walls or arranging for everybody to go for a walk together. That stuff is nice, but it's how you behave every single day in every single interaction that you have with every single person in your business. And I think that comes from the top down. It comes from the bottom up. It needs to be, so the definition of culture is the relationships and the feelings and sentiments and emotions that people in a workplace have for one another. So I don't think a HR manager can come in one day, be they the best HR manager in the world, and say, okay, we're going to change the culture now. I think it needs to be something that's built through very conscious hiring and making good choices at the start, almost like a pyramid, and then exhibiting the behaviors that you want to see in others every day in the office. And that's exactly how it works.
Yeah, so if everyone rocks in the door at like 11 a.m., that's your culture, right?
Exactly. It's what the group do together as a community. What direction do we all move in together as a team? Or if, for example, there's, like un-PC jokes being made that make one person uncomfortable. If that one person doesn't stand up and, quietly ask for that to stop, then you have a culture of that conduct being acceptable. Does that make sense?
Total sense, yeah.
So I always, in my role that I'm in now, we always talk about culture in terms of the behaviors that we don't walk past. And that's not just the people team or the leaders or the business owners, that's every single person. What don't you walk past?
And how do you measure that?
Just if there's a, an incident, a comment, a behavior, anything at all that you see, is it the habit of your people to, pull that person aside and have a really, really quick, nice conversation about, hey man, don't make jokes about X, Y, Z? Or does everybody snicker and kind of look at the floor? Do you see what I mean? That's kind of the difference for me between a great culture and a terrible culture. It's the behaviors that people don't walk past and that they call out.
And I think it's the communication piece as well, around the core values and the culture of an organization.
Absolutely.
Because we see so many double standards, don't we, in large organizations where the people understand the culture to be X, Y, and Z, but people at the big table seem to be contradicting those by their very actions and behaviors themselves, which doesn't really align well for people to buy into it in the first place. So it just seems to be a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom,
Yeah, absolutely. And I know of businesses where they talk a big game and they have a lovely big poster outside, but that's obviously no good unless you're living those values every day. I agree with you entirely.
So like, as we're talking about this here, it seems quite overwhelming in terms of all of the things that you have to be aware of in the recruitment process. So I'm keen to understand, like, how do you manage that? And, how do you prioritize candidates? And for example, if we had a specific number of roles, is it the case that you absolutely must have 3x coverage on that role? Do you start recruiting before a headcount is released next quarter? Or you kind of in a situation where you only have one candidate for one role, and if this candidate doesn't accept, God, I could be in trouble. We mightn't hit our hiring target for the quarter, etc. Maybe could you just take us through how you prioritize that, what help you use in that process? And, don't want to get into specifics around, ATSs or CRMs or anything of that nature, but really keen to understand, how do you manage that process? Because there's a lot to take in, right?
Yes. So I think, now correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, Ross, but I think your question is around how do you manage your funnel to make sure that you have the right levels of engagement to fill the roles that the business needs at certain times?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so obviously it's tricky, yeah, it's a massive challenge, but I think that exact challenge presents itself in many ways for many businesses. Like, if you're a hotel, how do you get the right number of bookings for your 100 rooms on a given night? And how you do that, I think basically is work really, really closely with every department across the business. Like, if you have a really good relationship with the sales analysts, you might get a bit of an understanding with them, with the sales directors, etc. Just have your ear to the ground, always be on top of your stuff. But also, I think it's very important to be prepared for an ever-changing business climate. And obviously that was never truer than this year. So I think of it, when you say about hiring processes, hiring campaigns and how you manage a process, I try to think about it sometimes like DEFCON, like the old army saying.
I remember it well. Yeah, War Games movie.
Yeah. So DEFCON 1 is, we are losing money and business opportunities are being blocked because we haven't filled this role. Obviously, you don't want to be there. But I would, in an ideal world, start recruiting actively every time when you're about DEFCON 4, maybe 3. But yeah, if you get into DEFCON 2, at that point, that's where I would be calling in all the resources. And that might be agencies, that might be like trying to do something really interesting with a campaign. One thing we've done with great success, actually, at HubSpot, was we got local agencies. So I was coming into that DEFCON 2 type stage where I really couldn't find anybody. And I was like, okay, I need to get help from an agency who know the market where I'm hiring from. And that was a massively valuable tool at different times as well.
Okay, so I suppose what you're saying there, it's kind of that tacit local knowledge, and that's particularly true when you are in a new country for the first time. What criteria do you use when you're evaluating a third party? And obviously American multinationals are, frantic organizations, they're high paced, they're hyper growth, etc., which is where a lot of people thrive. I certainly got a great kick out of it. Like, how do you evaluate an agency or even a vendor, quite frankly, who's going to be a fit for you? Like, what is it they're looking for? What are the expectations?
That's a good one. And maybe an uncommon opinion here. I don't know how some of my colleagues would answer that question, but for me, there has to be mutual benefit, right? Like, if I know that a certain agency doesn't have the right capability, or if they aren't showing me results after a certain amount of time, I know that it's not going to be beneficial for either of us. So I think the really important thing when assessing a vendor for me, and this is across any company I've ever worked at, is understanding how this agency can add value. So every agency says, oh, I have great candidates and I'll send you their resumes. But I want to know about examples. I want to know about where have you filled roles before and how can you help me in this fix? And if somebody, I think, can genuinely add value and solve some of our problems, happy days. That's exactly what we want.
Some people or some organizations take the stance that we never use agencies. And 75% of the time in our experience, that's a smokescreen, really, that they don't want to take up a lot of their time speaking with people that they don't know or trust, and that's perfectly acceptable, and it's perfectly normal. What's your view in general on agencies? Have you gotten value from agencies? Do they really have a place in the world in terms of getting top-notch candidates and that kind of thing?
Yes, absolutely.
That probably sounds like a loaded question, and I get it. But if you could be as
I don't know what you're hinting at there, John.
If you could be as objective as possible, that would be wonderful, because I think there is a bit of a misnomer that we can do all of this ourselves all of the time, but the reality is sometimes it ends up costing you a hell of a lot of money, and you get some very, very poor candidates,
I think agencies are like everything else, right? Some are good, some are terrible. It doesn't mean they're all good, it doesn't mean they're all terrible. But also an agency partner, I think for an in-house recruiter like I still am, is like a hairdresser. Like, if you find a good one who gets you, who gets your business, who gets what you're looking for, and you have a nice pleasant interaction with them back and forth, where they, call you a normal number of times, not 6 times a day, bingo. It's like a hairdresser. You just stay with them because you're like, great, this person can partner with me and they can help me solve my problems. Now, on the other hand, if it's an agency who, shall we say, follows less savory business practices and calls me like multiple times a day and never ever sends me anything useful, yeah, I'm probably going to end that relationship, and that's how it goes. It's the same with anything. If you went to a hairdresser and they gave you a terrible haircut, yeah, you'd go to the next place next time.
That's good feedback, because it's really about taking the time to understand the client's business. I've been on both sides of this fence, so I can speak relatively objectively about. I've used some fantastic recruitment agencies in my career to build and scale teams, and again, sometimes recruitment agencies are right up there in the pecking order with taxi drivers and these kind of people that where everybody seems to have a view.
I have no comment on that.
Yeah. Well, it just tends to polarize people. It tends to polarize people. They either dig it or they don't. So it's good to have an objective view of where agencies have really impacted on your on the things that you have to fulfill in your role. So it sounds like it's a blend of all of this stuff, right back to your three-pronged approach, I suppose, really.
That's it.
That
you have to keep all the fires stoked.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense, and I think that's good. It's really about that situational example. So show me an example where, and we've talked about this on prior shows from the interview process itself. Alan Temple shared that an interview is really a risk assessment, and if you're answering questions with "I have done in the past" versus "I would do if I was faced with that," it's clear who the lesser risk is, from a operational standpoint, because it is an operation at the end of the day, and sales is a process, and I strongly believe that. So I suppose as we wrap up here, Louise, I really wanted to drill into our final question. If you could summarize for us, if you would, what is the crack from an Irish perspective? And I know you're living in Sydney, Australia now, and I'm kind of keen to understand what the parallels are between Australian culture and the crack in Ireland, and also particularly want to talk about, like, how do you sell the crack to somebody who's non-English speaker to come here, and even hey, take us through that if you would, as we wrap up.
I could talk for 100 years, like most Irish people, about the crack. But the easiest way I define it, Ross, because I get this question a lot, especially from my Australian colleagues and friends, and the crack is like the force, right? You can't teach it, you can't buy it, you just either have it in your heart and soul and you let it out by singing and dancing and general merriment. Now, I think a lot of people maybe coming to Dublin, what I've seen a number of times with candidates is they have the crack, but they've never had the right tools to let it out before. And then you get them, say, to Temple Bar or Donaghy and Nesbitt, and the crack just flows straight out. Like when Ray picked up the lightsaber for the first time. And that for me is the crack.
I don't think I've heard anyone describe it in those terms whatsoever, but it's quite accurate, and I can certainly relate to it. And I know from an Australian perspective, I think they definitely are as productive as any other or company I've seen organizationally, country rather. But they seem to have fun along the way and sort of enjoy that kind of outdoor lifestyle. And I always say to candidates on calls, I'm not about to tell you it's a good idea to move to Ireland because of the weather. So let's just get that out of the way now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But I think the crack helps it, and this kind of multicultural ecosystem with tech as a kind of a infrastructural part of our economy, I think is hugely beneficial. And a lot of people have read of it ahead of time because these college kids across Europe are studying it in case studies and what have you. So I think that very much helps. Well, look, I really want to thank you for your time.
The very last point, sorry,
please go for it.
If I may interrupt, is just, and this is an piece of advice to all your listeners, don't make the same mistake I did, where you go to the US and ask, we're still friends to this day, thankfully. If he's listening, he'll know who he is. And I asked this man at a company party, was he having good crack?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the crack is strong with you, Louise.
Why, thank you.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I know. And I was talking with an American colleague of mine yesterday who was describing how he moved to Ireland, and he had heard people come into the office going, "What's the crack?" And he thought that he would try and fit in. And after 4 months, after 4 months, he decided he was confident enough that he would use this phrase, within his team. So he decided to open up Slack and ask what the crack was, but spelled it C-R-A-C-K, to which half of the office erupted in laughter, not realizing the guy couldn't spell. And I know as Irish speakers, we don't do any favors in that language of making it in any way phonetic in a lot of cases, but that was his story of kind of cultural nuance, as it were. Well, look, thank you again, Louise. Much appreciated.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's been our pleasure too. Take care.
Louise, great speaking with you. Be safe and be well, and may the crack be with you.
and with yourselves. Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Global Tech Leaders Podcast, designed for both established and aspiring career-focused tech rock stars, as well as helping leadership figure out how to speak global in today's multicultural world. For further details, check out sf-talent.com.